Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews, with your host, Arlyeon. For today's episode, I'll be covering the review key I received of DreadXP's second entry in their horror anthology, namely DreadX Collection 2. Much like the first game, this one's composed of an array of carefully curated titles by a handful of developers. But did I ultimately come away feeling that this was a solid selection of lovingly crafted titles? Or was this a collection of questionable clutter? Anyways, given this collection is in the same vein as the first and represents the hard work and talents of a dozen different devs producing very different games, I'll be using a similar format as the last collection, namely, sounding out a set of micro-reviews and ratings for all the individual games. That said, I'm also going to do my best to avoid this being a nightmarish monolithic monologue, so welcome to the lightning round. Kicking things off, our first game is The Mansion, which also dubs as DreadX 2's optional hub. Picking up from the hidden ending of the first game, you'll find out that you've been infected by some sort of illness, courtesy of an ominous tape recording. As it stands, you're now being held in quarantine, and being put through a mysterious series of tests meant to cure you, provided you can navigate the ghoulish puzzles riddled about the mansion you found yourself in. It's a neat concept, really, and I enjoyed the way it built a continuity between the games and began to actually provide an overarching narrative. I definitely appreciate the slow trickle of story provided via the audio tapes, as well as the comic book entries you find. I also found myself pleasantly surprised by the gameplay. Once you've given the full run of the mansion, it is rife with a solid array of conundrums. While some are fairly basic or boil down to seeking out items, there are a few clever ones in there, and I came away feeling that it was a small but ultimately solid puzzler. Just please ignore how bad I am at any and all music-related puzzles. I don't have too much to comment aesthetically, but I will say I did appreciate the voice acting and the creepy ambience it cultivated. Enough so that I can declare this portion of the DreadX collection a hit, so do yourself the favor and don't skip it. Next up is Akabaka's dark Lovecraftian dating sim / visual novel, Sucker for Love. After all, in a world where people already crack open D&D's monster manual and look at it like a dating catalog, who can question your choice to try and summon up an eldritch god in search of smooches? And thanks to a very pink eldritch tome, you're actually equipped to make your sordid memes come true, provided you get your blasphemous ritual on. Gameplay-wise, this is a fairly straightforward experience, given a lot of what you're doing is reading. There are rituals to enact, but there's not really much to figure out given they are straightforward and provide instructions. Nonetheless, I still found myself riveted by this game, given it supports some great writing. Things kick off with some very endearing comic beats, but become increasingly creepy as you continue to make your apocalyptic overtures towards your thick-tentacled waifu-to-be. Which, speaking of, whilst this game's visuals do generally lean towards the saccharine, it's not limited to that. Sucker for Love pulls off a few spooky flexes, the likes of which are accompanied by some solid sound design and quality voice acting from your Lovecraftian love interest. Frankly, this game had me so engrossed that I was more than happy to explore all its true endings and bad endings, which is why I'd rate it as a solid crit hit. It's also not the only narrative-centric title in the set either, given there's also Secret Cow Levels Another Late Night. This one's a bit meta, given it provides players with a simulated PC to explore. Along the way, they come across curious news articles about a game and the effect it's having on its players. And that's about that. The story is sparse, divided between elements like news pages and mock text messages used to establish its world. And this seeks into the gameplay, since beyond clicking around, you get to have some conversation with multiple dialogue options, which wound up feeling pretty linear, and low on the spook factor. I found myself more invested in just randomly clicking around the apps for Easter eggs like music or the super cute rat images. Which is why as a game, I'd rate Another Late Night as a fail, not due to any technical failure, but simply because it held no real appeal to me. Those rat images are worth checking out though. Anyways, that brings us to Daniel Mullen's bite-sized puzzle game Sillipsis, which places us in the shoes of an astronaut, albeit one whose mundane investigations are tragically interrupted by a freak accident which leaves him stranded on the surface of the moon. It's a nightmarish premise, the likes of which is only compounded by the sense of isolation hammered in as you march across the bleak desolation of the moon's surface with nothing to greet you save deathly silence and the sound of your own breath. And it only gets weirder from there. Whilst there is more to comment on for Sillipsis narratively speaking, it's very short and thus pretty easy to spoil, but I was a fan of how things unfurl. On a gameplay front, it's a much simpler experience, being a walking simulator with some very light puzzle solving. Overall, I did like Sillipsis, as it does a solid job of building up tension, along with some decent visuals and audios. My only real complaint is just how short it was and how the gameplay mostly just seems as a tool to extend the narrative without being all that challenging. Still, that didn't do anything to dilute my fondness for the title, and I would ultimately recommend it as a hit. And if you're hankering for isolation, there's also Bathysphere Labs' undersea tale of terror, the Diving Bell. This one leaves you as the sole surviving member of a research team after a tragic accident, tasked with filing out daily reports to an uncaring corporation and maintaining the facility as it comes apart at the seams. Storyline-wise, I appreciated some of its elements, such as the contents of the daily reports or the various notes which are scattered about the base, and which you should keep on top of. This actually extends further, however, to the sparse bits of dialogue you get to listen to. That said, mechanically I wasn't quite as impressed, given that the game boils down to a walking simulator with some light elements of resource management, which is to say self-medicating to manage your stress levels. There is some light fetch questing and button pushing, but not only did I find this irritating ultimately, I encountered a few bugs simply because I was diligent about exploring and didn't quite reach things in the exact steps the developers wanted me to. Which is why, even though I can appreciate the narrative beats and its shifting aesthetic, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the Diving Bell to everyone. As a game, it was a bit more lackluster, and I wasn't quite wowed by the conclusion. Ultimately, I rate it as a fumble, as it holds merit, but it's definitely rough around the edges. The walking simulators don't end there either, given Studio Torpilduke's exploration-oriented Undiscovered. Contextually, this is posed as a classified debriefing using video footage recovered from an expedition into some long-lost ruins. Obviously, it's ill-fated as fuck, though perhaps not as much as the decision to have a character select option with a pair of completely interchangeable choices. The fact that it doesn't really change dialogue or anything of real note felt like the real tragedy here. But to be fair, I don't mind the overall narrative of the story, just the characters didn't feel unique in the slightest. Unfortunately, this game's mechanics make it feel like work. For one thing, the camera angles for the game play out as though you're being followed by the other character, which, whilst interesting in a visual sense, can get annoying fast. And that's then further compounded by an absolutely abysmal move speed. That said, the element which really galled me was the fact that I managed to get caught on a texture and lost the ability to move, thus requiring me to restart the whole thing from scratch. Yeah, not cool Undiscovered, not cool. Anyways, given I've already talked a lot about the aesthetics, I suppose the only thing I need to mention is I didn't entirely mind the idea of emulating a sort of old school video camera feel. But goddamn, I wish I had actual control of it, though I did appreciate that hearing things I couldn't see helped to build tension. Still, I really wasn't fond of Undiscovered as a game. It was a ponderous slog that wound up feeling a lot like work, akin to working at a McDonald's while waist deep in molasses. Did I hate it? Not quite. Would I recommend it to anyone? Also no, which is why it boils down to a fail in my book. But wait, there's more! In case you're still hungry for horrific walking sims, there's also Vitas Games' Archilettra. Taking place in a generic-looking video game store, we find ourselves goaded into opening a package by a mysterious voice. In doing so, the store is made subject to all sorts of peculiar phenomena. And really, that's most of what I have to say about it, since the crux of your experience will be floating between a sort of weird experience designed to startle you or make you anxious. There is a bit of lore at the finale, but it missed the mark for me given how it plays out after the journey and hinges on a binary choice. The gameplay, however, is what really rankled me, as you're stuck in a small locale and there really isn't much to do other than interact objects needed to progress the story. And then endure whatever weird changes comes next. I think the part I despised the most was the looping. It just wouldn't fucking end. Aesthetically, I can't actually give it much grief, given some of the elements looked alright, but there were a lot of reused elements if you look too close, and there was something about the character models you encounter that just looks off. The music was alright at least. So the ultimate verdict remains the same. I really didn't like Archilettra. Actively. Felt like a very on-the-rails experience with very little to do, carefully cultivated in order to foster a sense of despair and monotony. Which to say, I wouldn't recommend this to anyone, and it earns a resounding fail to me. The list of games isn't done yet either, since we have Malik's The Toy Shop, which encompasses a few genres. This one places the player in a world I can only describe as crap-saccharine, as once they manage to vacate the ruined office space they start out in, they're greeted by the bright sight of a dystopian toy city. With a distinct lack of knowledge, they're left with nothing to do but begin a pilgrimage towards that fabled location, all the while trying to figure out what exactly is up with the world. And the weird visual glitches which occasionally overtake their vision, or the way conversations alter themselves mid-speech. Storyline-wise, there's actually a lot going on in this one, and it really piqued my interest, motivating me to seek out notes and NPCs for lore. And sure, while I could predict some plot elements, it still possessed a number of more ambiguous story threads for me to mull over long after I'd finished. Mechanically, it's a much more mixed bag. The game starts out as a bit of an exploration-oriented game, with a lot of focus being on introducing the oddness of the world. But it rapidly begins to introduce other elements, such as an extended platforming sequence and a rather lengthy FPS. It's not bad per se, but there's definitely times where it feels janky or a little bit glitchy, and other moments which overstay their welcome. Darkness sections. I will give some credit towards the aesthetic. There's definitely a lot of fun to be had with the game's visuals, but what I felt really salvaged this title was the overall concept. Essentially, whilst I wouldn't recommend the toy shop to everyone, especially given how some of the segments drag on, are glitchy, or feel lackluster, I still could appreciate the overall concept and narrative enough that I still feel I want to see a bit more of it, just to figure out where I was going with its storyline. Enough so that I could at least rate this as a fumble. And so, David Szymanski's Squirrel Stapler. Yup, that's a hell of a title, but nothing compared to the experience of booting it up and being greeted by the sight of, you know what, actually just boot it up. Take the sight in. Anyways, once you process that, you're told you need to make a coat of freshly slaughtered squirrels. Also, God's coming, yeah. From there, the game's best described as a soothing waltz through a squirrel-infested forest and the occasional page of haunting lore. Check those every day. That, and some classy squirrel facts. Still, whilst the main game vacillates between being creepy and hilarious, the final act was hands down the most unnerving moment for me over the course of the entire DreadX collection. Ambience-wise, while things are simple visually, it still did manage to startle and unsettle me at times, but it was the sound effects that really tied everything together. Provided you make your way through the entire game, you're in for a genuinely solid treat once you reach the finale, which is why I have to say I really enjoyed Squirrel Stapler. The fact mechanics evolve and it introduced more elements with each passing day had me hooked. And, you know, despite its outlandish name, it's a crit hit. It's not overly long, it's simple to grasp, and it's genuinely such a solid experience all the way through. Which, whilst I didn't feel overly compelled to play it again, it still stands out as just such a creepy thing to think back on. Following that up, we have a pure puzzler, courtesy of John Szymanski, namely Charlotte's Exile. In this, you take the role of a man searching for a way to liberate his wife from the eldritch plane she's been banished into. Admittedly, it's not exactly for unjust causes, given she's been possessed by the spirit of Nyarlathotep. Still, not even the risk of unleashing an apocalyptic eldritch entity will stop you from researching a way to release her, though other things may be seeking to meddle. Honestly, I don't have to say much about the story here, as the crux of it is front-loaded. The rest of what you have to experience comes in the form of some neat lore contained in the actual book you're translating, as well as a pair of endings you can lock based on the outcome of the ritual you're trying to perform. That said, I did overall enjoy the presentation of it, and the fact that it managed to combine studying eldritch lore with the gradual decoding of a cipher and the story it's presenting you is excellent, and that you're parsing together the actual ritual from these actions. It's not something I've seen before as a gameplay device, and made for a mostly relaxing slice of time. Mostly. Honestly, Charlotte's Exile is a good bit of fun. It looks good, has a solid bit of sound design, and had me hooked from start to finish, enough so that I'd say it fully warrants being called a hit. Now, a more surprising entry for me was Scythe Dev Team's horror-fueled FPS To the End of Days. All efforts have failed to stymie the approach of a massive comet. In the wake of its inevitable approach, mankind has begun to fray at the seams. Now you must make your way to your family so you might spend the end of days with them. So, frankly, for a game which makes reference to Carthank, yeah, it's there, I was surprised by how much I found myself embracing this game's narrative. Not only did it give me a continually escalating apocalypse, I had a delightfully hammy protagonist to control who could not help but grittily monologue as I killed people.
What have I become?
Like, I'll admit, it's a mechanically basic FPS with some pretty darn unforgiving checkpoints, but beyond a few rough patches, I found it to be a solid combination of both challenging and charming. Admittedly, things didn't innovate much over the course of the playthrough, but they also never grew tiresome. And again, I dug the aesthetic, whether it was the overtop edginess of the protagonist or the game's soundtrack, and the visuals aren't bad. So all in all, To the End of Days serves as an excellent redemption arc for Scythe Dev Team in my eyes, and a solid hit. Next up on the list, there's Panstas's The Thing in the Lake, a retro-styled horror adventure title. In this, the lives of 4 individuals converge when they arrive at an ill-fated lake, whose dark history begins to re-emerge. Now they must do their best to uncover its secrets and survive. The thing in the lake. Yeah, title drop. Anyways, both narratively and mechanically, there's a lot I appreciate about this game, as each of its 4 chapters focuses on a different character, helping to also introduce different elements. What starts out as a fairly straightforward experience becomes increasingly complex as both the scale of the story and the lake environment expands with each new character. It's also the title I found the most challenging bar none in this anthology, given that the dangers of the lake and the intricacies of the tool you need to navigate your way forward also grow. Enough so that I actually found myself leaning on the story mode near the climax, which did make things noticeably easier, but didn't actually prevent me from dying a heap. Not enough that I couldn't pause to take in the sights and sounds though, and I will say that the overall aesthetic of the game has further piqued my interest in the developer's style and his other works. So it probably shouldn't be too surprising that I consider this title a resounding success. There's just so much in regards to setting tension, building lore, and making use of these areas, and gradually introducing more complex puzzles and elements to explore, which contributes to the replayability that I couldn't rate this as anything less than a crit hit. Which brings us to our final title, namely Wither Studios' entry, Touched by an Outer God, a roguelite FPS. In a world overrun by horrific flesh monsters, a lone girl journeys to find her father, who was last seen battling the alien Blight. Unfortunately, she hits a snag early on and finds herself needing to rely on the same powers overtaking the world. Storyline-wise, it's fairly light, with most of it being optional notes and coinciding voice lines as you proceed. Still, these are well done, and it does culminate in a satisfying ending. And the gameplay is a lot of fun to boot. More or less, it's an arena-esque FPS, albeit with a roguelite upgrade system, which offers a fair amount of customization to your character and how they function. Some upgrades branch off from others, or exclude other abilities when taking, lending itself to very different playstyles with each playthrough. And I do mean playthrough, given the permadeath nature of the game means you'll likely see a few builds before you reach the end. Especially if you're like me, an idiot, and pick hard mode off the hop. Moving on to the graphics, the game's solid. There's some gruesome details in the enemies, and the upgrades make visible changes to your character, which is awesome to see. Plus some pretty gnarly sound design. All in all, I'd say this game warrants being called a hit, as it's enjoyable and accessible, with my only real issue being that the introduction's a bit long and empty feeling before the meat of the game kicks in. And it's optional, so Anyways, that brings us to the conclusion, and I generally say this makes for a strong sequel to DreadX Part 1. The titles in this are generally solid, with a few that really stuck with me long after I'd put the game down. Whilst there are a few titles I was less enamored with, even they generally had elements that were interesting or at least presented some neat niche ideas. As a whole, I'd consider the collection a hit. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. With all that said though, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.